Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica Blaustein, Senior Account Director with the Healthcare Partnerships team at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Thank you all for joining us today for the MDA Industry Update webinar, Natural History in Becker Muscular Dystrophy, sponsored by Edgewise Therapeutics. MDA's Industry Update webinars are programs which provide an opportunity for the community to receive information and updates impacting care and treatment directly from pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. These webinars are just a part of MDA's education resources. We encourage you to visit the community education pages of mda.org, where you'll find an abundance of resources, informative recorded webinars, and listings for upcoming educational events. Of course, if you have any questions or need assistance, the MDA Resource Center is available to you by email at resourcecenter@mdausa.org, calling 1-833-ASK-MDA1, or you can reach the Resource Center on mda.org. If time permits, we'll conclude this webinar with a brief Q&A. Please put your questions into the Q&A as they arise, and the speakers will address them at the end. After the webinar concludes, you'll receive a survey link. Please complete this short survey so your voice is heard, and you can help us create more impactful programming for future events. Now, I'd like to welcome Sarah Tenser, Director of Patient Advocacy at Edgewise Therapeutics, to introduce the program. Sarah, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you to MDA for the opportunity to share with this group today. Really appreciate everyone's time in joining us on a Thursday afternoon. So today we will be sharing about natural history in Becker muscular dystrophy. I am joined by Dr. Sachdev and Dr. Donovan, who will be speaking to you about different pieces of this over the next half hour. So during this webinar today, we will give a brief overview of Edgewise, and then dive into some background on natural history, describing a little bit about what a natural history study is, what we've learned from natural history studies in Becker muscular dystrophy so far, and also how this information is used with everything from disease progression, informing our clinical care practices, and developing and evaluating clinical trials. As a brief overview, Edgewise was founded in 2017. We're based in Boulder, Colorado, and we're focused on developing novel muscle-targeted therapies. And we have programs in both Becker and Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We focus very specifically on muscle injury, specifically muscle injury caused by muscle contraction in Duchenne and Becker. And we are studying an investigational agent that would hopefully be able to be used alone or in combination with other therapies, regardless of mutation. This is an overview of our clinical program. We won't be going very in-depth about any of these today, but you can see we have ongoing trials both in Becker and Duchenne. Our current Becker trial, the Grand Canyon pivotal cohort, is pivotal phase 2, but acts as a phase 2 or phase 3. Dr. Donovan will speak a little bit about that. And then Lynx and Fox are our two Duchenne programs that wrapped up phase 2 last year. So I will now hand it over to Dr. Sachdev to speak a little bit about natural history in Becker. He's joining us from MSU Healthcare. You can see his other affiliations here, and we are so grateful to have you joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Sachdev, and I will hand it over to you.
And thank you, Sarah, for having me here, and to the Muscular Dystrophy Association for hosting today's webcast. The natural history of Becker muscular dystrophy has not been well described, and it's really something to think that the first natural history studies of this disease didn't really start to emerge until 2016, and to think that development at Edgewise started in 2017 is really something to think about the attention to the disease at its infancy of understanding. And we're still at that infancy of understanding. So I'm really pleased anytime I have a chance to talk on the topic. So what is a natural history study? A natural history study follows a group of people over time and establishes the way that their disease process or medical condition evolves over that period of time without necessarily testing a specific intervention. And so the goal is to determine the effects in overall health, establish relationships between organ dysfunction and the disease that were not previously understood or appreciated, and to understand how the current standard of care is being applied across a population, or what is it that is being accepted as the standard of care today. So these natural history studies really form the foundation of organizing our thought around a disease. And so organizing that thought then allows us to do a number of different things. We get to understand disease progression. We get to understand how proactive interventions might be effective in that disease progression. And we get to organize clinical trials around that disease progression. In rare disease in particular, these natural history studies are important because you're starting to see efforts to compare the progression of a patient population against the expected natural history of that disorder, and starting to think about innovative clinical trial design then that perhaps moves beyond the concept of a placebo arm. And in rare disease, it can be very difficult to recruit adequate numbers and have adequately powered studies. And so these natural history studies help us understand what the baseline progression of a disease could be. And so in the last 10 years, we have had really three major groups publishing on natural history cohorts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these data sets over the course of these slides. So what have we learned from them? We've learned study by study, unfortunately, it's still a small group of studies, that almost half of patients living with Becker lose the ability to run in their early 30s. From another disease study, we found that Becker patients started using a wheelchair, either part or full-time, often in their mid-30s. And yet, in several studies suggest 30 to 40% of patients living with Becker are unable to walk at all by their 40s or 50s. So these are observations that are both clinically reasonable. We think of Becker as a progressive disease, but also clinically heterogeneous because it can be hard to understand exactly when a patient might start to decline. And that makes Becker difficult to counsel a patient on. And so we start to understand what is happening in the bulk of the population. Their natural history studies have shown that cardiac health in Becker is variable and that there is no direct correlation between cardiac involvement and skeletal involvement. And that last finding is particularly important because if we think about major drivers of mortality and we look to the skeletal muscle to inform us of cardiac health, we might be missing a major risk to our patients. So these are themes that are starting to emerge in the last 10 years of understanding on Becker. So how might we talk about Becker and measure Becker over time? And I would draw your attention to the North Star Ambulatory Assessment. Now, about a year ago, there was another video that was put out with the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and it featured Dr. Duong from Stanford. Dr. Duong spoke really at length on the topics of the NSAA, and I draw your attention to that video for a really robust conversation around it. I'll introduce to you the NSAA here, the NSAA is patient driven. So the patient reports the ability to perform with respect to 17 different areas. And the scoring system is fairly clinically obvious. Can the patient perform a certain activity with no adaptations? Can they uh, do it with adaptations, and the reason is driven for the adaptations is weakness? Or can they not perform that particular task at all? And so these tasks are meaningful for different ranges of function. They involve functions that can be done in the seated position, functions that involve the standing position, functions that involve transitions between those positions. And the large bulk of these positions and functions relate to day-to-day activities around the home. And so one can see the utility then in having a conversation about the NSAA in the conversation of function in Becker. And so using the NSAA as our metric to understand motor function in Becker, the natural history studies that have been published are seen here in the graph on your right. And this is a snapshot, but these are some of the studies that have followed patients the longest. The first thing I'll do is I'll point out the particular references on the graph and the N number on those references. These are not enormous studies, 21, 45, and 15 patients. That reflects that this is a rare disorder. What is most important then is what is the aggregate apparent effect, right? When you pool the data, assuming that the patients are relatively homogeneous, can you start to elicit trends in that pooled data? And it would appear that you can start to draw a trend line when you plot this data out. And that's what you're looking at here on the right. NSAA score decline over time. And roughly what you're looking at is that the NSAA appears to decline somewhere between 1 and 1.7 points annually. And so the most conservative estimate as an aggregate for these studies would be that 1.0 point. But the important thing there is annually. And so when there is a declining trajectory that has set in, the expectation appears to be it will progress. And so then the next question is, well, what does a point mean? And that's the topic of our next slide. So recall the scoring system here on the NSAA is 2 points means you can perform a task without the use of an aid. 1 point is that you require an aid, and the reason that you require the aid is because of weakness you attribute to the disease. And 0 points is that you cannot do a task at all. And so when we think about the what does 1 point mean, you can see that 1 point is the difference between independent function and assisted function. And that is a meaningful difference. Next slide, please. And then how is it that the disease appears to change over time? What appears to happen is that functions that are declining appear to decline further as time progresses. And so what you see here in this graph is that if a patient is initially scoring quite highly on the NSAA, that is, they have a good amount of function, and they start to decline with respect to, for example, lower extremity function, how might those functions in that category reduce? And it does stand to reason that if a patient today can stand with heels, as they decline, it might be that they might only be able to hop on one leg with assistance and then have difficulty stepping down, and then ultimately lose more substantial function. And so this pictorial starts to give you an idea of, as time progresses, how might certain functions progress and how that might map to different regions of the body and then ultimately tasks in the home. Next slide, please. So natural history studies help with us thinking then about disease management. So they help us understand how we should deploy disease monitoring. And the most important part of that conversation thus far is the lack of clear link between skeletal muscle decline and cardiac involvement, and then the need for a high index of suspicion for monitoring the heart, regardless of where the muscle is. Helps us understand progression. So when a patient begins their journey of decline in Becker, it appears that that journey progresses and progresses at a predictable rate of 1 to 1.7 points on this NSAA per year. And then it facilitates communication with the providers for proactive care plans to understand, do we want to attempt rehabilitation? Do we want to attempt devices? Which devices might we require? Should we refer to orthotics, for example? And so that dialogue helps with the patient-doctor relationship. Next slide, please. And so I will hand the conversation back to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sachdev. We really appreciate the overview. And we will now transition to Dr. Donovan to share how natural history data is used to develop and evaluate clinical trials. Dr. Donovan is the Chief Medical Officer here at Edgewise Therapeutics, so can share a little bit about how we at our company have also used this information from natural history to inform the work that we're doing. Thank you, Dr. Donovan.
Thank you both. So it is important, when we are designing a clinical trial, the information from the natural history studies, as you heard, is important in terms of being able to tell individuals with Becker how the disease may progress, how they may think about, well, what might life be like in a few years? In a clinical trial, what we're trying to understand is there something that we can measure that will change over a period of time and with the drug? And is that going to be sensitive enough for us to show the FDA and other regulatory bodies that the drug works? It's that simple. And so what we found from the natural history studies is that once people start to decline, they continue to decline. If they are at the maximum with the North Star, then they tend to continue for a while. You can't tell when they're going to start to decline. So what that has told us is that for including patients in the trial, we are including patients who have started to show signs of weakness, who have started to have a North Star that is below 32. Now remember, the maximum is 34. So that helps us in terms of identifying the patients for the study, because we love to include everybody in the study, and we get asked that all the time, but we also need to find a group of patients that will be able to show us a difference with the drug versus with no drug over a reasonable period of time. We also need to choose what we're going to measure in a clinical trial. And the information that has been shared in the literature on North Star tells us that is a measure which has very little or less noise to it So we're looking for being able to see the difference without a lot of noise in the information that we're getting. So that's why we chose the North Star as the primary endpoint for Grand Canyon. And that variability in the natural history is something that we then use to be able to determine about how many people are needed for the clinical trial. And in Grand Canyon, it turned out that we needed somewhere north of 100 patients in the study that we would need to enroll. So that guides us in terms of how long the study is going to be, how many people, what measures we use in the study. All that is important, and we draw on that from the natural history study, as well as listening to people in terms of what measures, what is important to them in terms of disease progression. So on the next slide, we also, as I mentioned, we need to use this to go to the FDA, to the regulatory bodies. And we use the natural history data in different ways. Once we have clinical trial results, we can use it to design the study, but also what the regulatory body wants to see is that if we are comparing a drug to a placebo, that the individuals who have taken placebo look like the natural history, that we can be pretty sure that the drug is having an effect. It's not just the placebo group was different for some reason. So it gives the regulators a lot of faith in the drug to be able to compare it to the natural history. Moreover, when we look at clinical trials, we try to make them as short as feasible. In a disease that progresses similar to Becker, this is a year and a half. But we also want to give individuals the opportunity to continue on in the trial in an open label extension where everybody gets the drug at that point. And we continue to be able to gather information to look at the safety of the drug and to understand also how the disease progresses in these individuals. Now, without natural history, we wouldn't have anything to compare to. So it's important for understanding open label extensions that to be able to compare to natural history. Now, next, in our clinical program, we have used natural history and modeling of natural history to understand the data. The ARCH study was our initial study in 12 patients. Those patients have gone on into an open label study, MESA, and they've now been on drug for well over 3 years. So being able to see that they have been relatively stabilized over that period, they're stable, then is very reassuring to get that information. The Canyon study, as Sarah mentioned, we finished last year. That was a 1-year study where we were able to look at, and again, look at the placebo group. Does it match natural history? And saw similar findings in terms of encouraging stabilization in the North Star ambulatory assessment. And on the next slide, our pivotal study, Grand Canyon, is ongoing. 175 patients have enrolled in the study. It's an 18-month study, and we are looking at men with North Star scores between 5 and 32. So in the portion of the disease where you can see the decline with the North Star ambulatory assessment. And looking at the variability, that allows us to power the study appropriately, that we have enough patients in the study to believe that we should be able to see an effect. They come in every 3 to 6 months and are taking the drug, which is an oral drug, a pill once a day. And that will be available, the results of that, in the fourth quarter of this year. So stay tuned for that. So thank you to the individuals and their families. It's a stress on everybody who has participated in the trial, as well as all of the investigators and site personnel across the country and world, actually, who have supported this. So we're very grateful because we couldn't do it alone, certainly, and we know that it is a burden to be in these studies. So thank you for your attention. And we have, I believe we have some questions in the chat.
We do. Thank you so much, Dr. Donovan. We have a few questions that have come in, and if anyone else has additional ones, you are welcome to submit those through the Q&A function. We have just a few minutes left, so we'll get through as much as we can, but if any come in right at the last moment, we do get records of those so we're able to follow up if there's things we aren't able to get to during the time today. So one question that came in was about the ability to study individuals that are lower on the North Star. So maybe have a North Star score of 1 or 0. And so given what we learned today, can y'all share a little bit about what the possibilities for that are with research?
Mhm. So those are our patients that are non-ambulatory. So most of we are not able to use that. What we are looking at, though, is also the upper limb function. And we do measure upper limb function in the study, and potentially could also do that in a non-ambulatory trial in the future. But we aren't studying that right now. That is something for the future.
And can you also speak to whether or not the trials are looking at respiratory concerns, or if that's something that is also being evaluated in natural history?
Yeah. They are looking at, we do look at respiratory function as well as cardiac, which is very important in following these patients. And I will say also, to ask Dr. Sachdev, the natural history studies also inform what needs to be done in clinical practice, certainly, in terms of respiratory and cardiac issues.
Yes, I would certainly agree. The focus here is that the natural history studies thus far have unfortunately been quite small, and that is just a function of a single center or a small group of centers. The kinds of efforts that Edgewise is bringing to this area are really going to meaningfully expand the data available on the disease. And my hope is then meaningfully understand some of the other areas of the disease that are impacted over time. So really, I would encourage the community to think forward in terms of these topics.
Yeah. And then we had a logistics question about whether or not attendees will receive a link to the recording and/or slides. And yes, this is being recorded. Jessica, you can chime in here, but it will be sent out and then posted on the MDA website. That'll be a few weeks from now, but it'll be accessible that way.
Exactly correct. We'll be posting it in about 4 weeks or so. We'll send out an email with a link to the recording as soon as that's available to everyone who registered for the webinar.
Wonderful. And then the last thing I'll draw attention to is we do have a QR code on the screen here. Edgewise puts out a about quarterly community newsletter, and when we do have new information to share, as Dr. Donovan shared, we should hopefully have top-line data from the Grand Canyon study towards the end of this year. We use that as an outlet to share with the community, as well as partnering with organizations like MDA to share when new results are available. And so for anyone who is interested in subscribing to that newsletter or seeing any of the other resources we have available on our website, you can follow that QR code. Or if you're not a QR code person, the full link is there as well. But I think that's the end of our time today. So thank you again to everybody who attended, to MDA for hosting this webinar and allowing us to share this information, and then for Dr. Sachdev and Dr. Donovan for sharing with us today.
Thank you.